In our lesson for January the 4th, we continue with our study of Ezra. Our focus will be on chapter 7. Now, the actual, primary text is 7:1 through 10, but we need to kind of expand beyond that to get the full picture of this lesson. So we'll look at basically all of the 7th chapter and reflect a little bit on chapter 8. When I did my dissertation, I chose to do it on a man by the name of Harry Emerson Fosdick. He was a famous preacher at that time. He actually was the preacher at Riverside Church in New York from 1930 to 1946. And I wasn't writing my dissertation during that time, by the way. But anyway, he was still alive when I was doing my dissertation. And he was one of the great preachers of America during the first half of the 20th century. He was one of the great preachers, but he's also one of the great religious leaders. And I did my dissertation on his Christology. But as I read all of his books, there were a number of just pregnant phrases that he would come out with. And one that stuck with me from his autobiography. When he was talking about growing up in his home, he made this statement. He said, "In our family, faith is not so much a faith is not so much a form as it is a force." And I think that's an important phrase, because the truth of the matter in many of our lives, and also perhaps in many churches, faith is exactly that. It's a form that we follow. It's a routine that we go through, but it doesn't have the force that drives our life. Harry Emerson Fosdick said, "In our family, faith was not so much a form as it was a force." What we see in churches today also seem to be true of among these exiles who had returned, and that's the setting in our text. They have come back. As we talked about last week, they laid the foundation, then they built the temple. Our lesson now picks up about 80 years later, and we'll see that instead of being a force that pushes them forward in the service of God, religion has pretty well become a form. Now that's the setting for our lesson now, beginning in chapter 7. Now, two things have happened so far in our study of the book of Ezra. First of all, because of the decree of Cyrus, ruler of Persia, 40,000 exiles had come back home, and they made a new beginning. We talked about that in last week's lesson. Chapter 7, verse 6 reminds us that they came back under the blessing of the king of Persia, Cyrus, and that they came back under the guidance of God's protection. Look at verse 7. It says, verse 6 says, "The king had granted him everything he asked, for the hand of the Lord his God was on him." So Ezra now getting ready to come back. He has the blessings of the king, and he has the blessings of God. When he gets back home, or when the exiles get back home, they determine to make the most of the opportunity, and so they do all these things we've talked about in last week's lesson, laid the altar and built the temple. And as a result of that, they ended up celebrating God, and they're ready to go. Now, our lesson picks up now 80 years later. And when Ezra comes back onto the scene, he discovers that things are not going well. Even though the temple had been reconstructed, the work of God is not being done, and the word of God is not being proclaimed. Ezra comes in now to save the day. So who is this Ezra that we are introduced to here in chapter 7? Well, we might say that he is God's man for the hour. We see the shadow of his personality now that will fall across the rest of the book of Ezra and a good bit of the book of Nehemiah as well. So who is this Ezra? Well, if you look at verse 7, at chapter 7, you'll see some things about him. Let me point these three out. I have them on your outline. The first thing is we see that Ezra is a man of gratitude. First thing he does when he comes back, he sings the doxology to God. We have this in verses 27 and 28. He says, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of our Father, who has put it into the king's heart to bring honor to the house of the Lord of Jerusalem in this way, and who has extended his good favor to me before the kings and his advisors." So we have Ezra, a man who knows how to be grateful, a man who knows how to be thankful. The second thing is that he is a man of courage. He refuses, well, let me just read the verse. It'll explain it. When he's getting ready to come back, he says that, verse 22 of chapter 8, he said, "I was ashamed to ask the king for soldiers and horsemen to protect us because we had told the king, the gracious hand of the Lord is on us." So Ezra had told the king, he said, God's going to protect us. Oh, then, by the way, yeah, we need 10,000 soldiers to go with us. No, he said, I'm not going to do that. Showing the courage and his willingness to depend upon God. And the third thing we see, and this is reflected in a statement in chapter 9, we see that he was a man of commitment. He reflected a radical reaction to the people's unfaithfulness. Chapter 9, verse 3 says, when I heard this, that is, when I heard that the